Welcome to episode 28 of Facts on the Ground. My name is Misty Winston, and I am joined as always by my co-host Jesse Zerowell. Today we have a bit of a British invasion. My good friend and host of Red Star Radio, Alexander Davidson, is on. I almost just straight up called you Alex. But anyways, thanks for joining us on the show today, Alex. I appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me, Misty, and you, Jesse. And unlike the British invasion, any mop top that was on here a long time ago.
It's a thing of the past.
It's
a
thing of the 90s.
Well, I mean, I think we all wish we could, put the 90s far in the past memory. I wanted to start off by talking to you, and this is intentional because I'm sure you see on Twitter, I get a lot of heat for criticizing the left. You do the same thing, and I love you for it. You don't coddle them either, which is nice. So I wanted to kind of ask you sort of how you see the left. I think that in the U.S. and the U.K. we have very similar, although our countries are different, I think we have very similar situations happening right now. And it seems that we have a very impotent and cowardly left movement. Can you kind of speak on that and where you see the movements right now, the situation they find themselves in?
The only movement that exists now is one that the same one that exists when you flush a toilet, which is that it descends into a sewer rapidly, which is what essentially the left so-called revival has ended up. And it all comes down really to the material cause, which is that in Britain we haven't had the necessary recovery of working class political power that would underpin even a successful social democratic movement would need to be underpinned by more strike action, more confident working class action in terms of take on employers and actually win demands. That just does not exist at the moment, or if it does, it exists in very small pockets which are not engaging in the kind of widespread generalized struggle that was necessary for the social democratic reforms of the post-World War II period to exist. What's happened is post-2008, post-recession, we've had a bunch of people see their social status go downwards who used to be in the lower middle class or the upper part of the working class, who've seen whatever few assets they have disappear or be severely devalued. And it's that layer of people which has gravitated towards the Sanders and Corbyn movements specifically. Though both men did attract a degree of working class support, they weren't backed by organized working class action. It was a movement of the lower middle class and professional classes to get behind these guys with the hope that they would be able to do some things that would alleviate the falling status of those middle class people who were turning to some forms of leftism. A lot of other people got swept up in that as well. But the reason why it's such a contradictory mess is, to expand on my original point, because there isn't mass working class base there. You have a politics based on the middle class of Britain and the USA, or a middle class of anywhere is always going to be an unstable formation. I mean, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were observing that in France in the 1840s. We haven't really seen class structures haven't really changed. So in terms of what the different classes do. So when you have a movement based on the middle class, doesn't matter whether it's a movement on the left or the right, it's going to be a very unstable formation because these people hover between the ruling class and the working class, and then their political perspectives bounce between the two. And so when you end up with such a mess that the Sanders campaign was this time round, or the second Corbyn election campaign, both men, and also the weaknesses of both men. I mean, both men, Corbyn in particular is the epitome of the middle class English leftist. He's a very decent man in some respects, but he's also a guy who lives in relative comfort in North London, which is not something that 99% of the British population can say, that they live in relative comfort. And he wasn't prepared or pushed into taking the political risks that would have been necessary to actually make them even the smallest part of his program come true. The same is true of Sanders. If you look back on the history of your country, as I'm sure you and your audience has done, the level of militancy that was required in the 30s to scare the shit out of the ruling class in the US, to even give the very watered down social democratic reforms of the Roosevelt era, was gigantic. It took basically them fearing that several states in the US were going to go into armed rebellion unless they made some concessions. You know, a bunch of middle class people voting for a guy is not on the same level. You know, here or there. Here, they in the 30s, the British High Command of the army, their biggest worry was an internal insurgency in the 1930s. It wasn't the Nazis. You know, they're rather like them. It was an internal working class uprising, because not only had you millions of working class people in the old coal fields, steel industries, where you had basically armies of workers all in one industry, all working together, all of whom, or many of whom, were veterans of World War One and knew how to handle a gun. They were terrified they were going to get an insurgency. So after World War II, they were also terrified that they were going to get it again then. So they had to make concessions because the social forces were as they were. They're not that way now. We're both of us coming off. I mean, your left got really extinguished in the 50s after House Un-American Activities Committee, and then Taft-Hartley killed the American Union movement in a way that's never recovered from. We haven't recovered from 84, 85, and the defeat of the mining unions, and then the destruction of industry. And a lot of the left is just wishing really hard that if they just post harder on Twitter or vote more or get more hysterical, that they can conjure up the forces necessary to make social reforms. Not going to happen. And the working class in both the United States and Britain, it seems, is not part of their calculations at all. In fact, they leave the working class out of it, because the kind of politics these people put forward is hyper individualized, utopian in the worst sense of the term, which is that it bears no connection to reality, and they go from wild utopianism of saying something like abolish the police tomorrow to vote for Joe Biden in a paragraph, because you can't get to point A because you have no idea how to get there. You don't know how to carry out the level of political education and organization that would be necessary for you to remove the forces of the capitalist state. So therefore, you go from saying the extreme ultra demand to the lowest possible non-demand in the snap of a pair of fingers. Because if you've no idea how to get to A, you're going to fall into B very, very quickly, especially if it's a movement based on the unstable, fluctuating politics of the American or British middle class. So that's where we are. I was part of the Labour Party for 3 years. I left before the second election because I could see where it was going. The ruling class in Britain, even though Corbyn's campaign was very small in terms of the adjustments it actually wanted to make to the economy, because the British economy is so hyper financialized in terms of where the profits come from, the ruling class cannot contemplate or cannot make the concessions that would be necessary for Corbyn's ideas to work. And they weren't prepared to. So they used the Brexit question to completely gut and destroy the Labour Party, because the ruling class and the really clever ones, politicians, the ones who work in the senior sort of think tank positions, the deep state guys, the people who make the real plans and have a lot of the real power, they understand how class works in Britain and the US. You'll get the same guys in the US understood how it worked too. That's how they managed to destroy the Sanders campaign, by playing on its contradictions. We got the same here. They knew very well that the biggest weak point in Corbyn's whole thing was the fact that he had this middle class left layer that absolutely adored the EU, because they think of it as this terrifically sophisticated thing where they can travel around Europe without a fucking passport. Not that it's a vicious imperialist organization which is dedicated towards smashing down trade barriers, lowering wages all the way across Europe, which is what it was all about, by, because if you have free movement of capital and free movement of labor and zero union power, well, what else is it going to be for?
I would say
but
it also benefited NATO as well.
Yeah, well, NATO and the EU are twin projects. Don't really have one without the other. They're trying to pretend that they're rivals, but they're not. They operate in business together. So they preyed on that contradiction, and it was Keir Starmer was their chosen agent, and he, by forcing through that we're going to have a second referendum, lost Labour enough working class votes all the way across the north, west, northeast, and far north of England to basically just destroy that second campaign. And it was we could see it coming like an iceberg on a clear day, but nobody wanted to listen. And of course, because the trade unions are so weak and useless and dominated by sort of limp bureaucrats who are also because they're more dedicated to preserving their position as mediators of class struggle and managers of it rather than advocates for it. They also didn't force any changes on that strategy. So we ended up in a horrific defeat. The same thing was done with Sanders, though it was more the corporate horrendous identity politics that was forced into the Sanders campaign. I think that was probably one of the detonators of it that probably repulsed quite a lot of ordinary Americans. But some people, as I've said a lot on Twitter and others have as well, some people in the Corbyn circle and the Sanders circle did very well out of the whole thing. So like there's a whole layer around Sanders of people who latched onto his campaign, who come out of this much better off, who were pretty well off anyway, but have managed to really advance their careers and their bank balances. Same thing here. And they wouldn't even defend Corbyn when he got suspended on a bogus anti-Semitism charge. The people who made their careers off him suddenly were all vanished into a puff of cowardice. So it's in a pretty shit state. I'm not negative in terms of what I think about the future, though, because it's a phase we had to go through. We had to go through that phase of the people who'd been seen their belief in the system of capitalism as it was set up pre-2008. That belief gets shook. They fall out of it. They look for radical solutions. They make a fucking mess of it because we haven't solved the fundamental problem, which is how do we organize working class resistance in a way which is going to actually shake the system? Even if your perspective is you want some kind of meaningful reform, we're not in a place yet where they're terrified enough to give us that. So we need to address that.
I want to touch on something. Yeah, I want to touch on something you said really quickly before I forget to do it, because you said that, the Corbyn supporters weren't willing to push him to take risks. And I think that is so critical to talk about, because it's the same thing in the U.S. Leftists do not want to criticize leftists. It's like, oh, we're eating our own, you're a purist, whatever. And if you're not going to hold your own accountable, I don't know how you expect to win anything. Bernie Sanders is not a saint. He's not perfect. He's a career politician. He needs to be pushed. He needs to be held accountable. But if you criticize Bernie Sanders, suddenly you're a purist, and I don't know why you're doing this, and what are you hoping to gain from this? And these are the same people who then tell me they're going to hold Joe Biden accountable and push him to the left. And
that's working
it's very
well
frustrating
so far.
to me. I know, right? Neera Tanden's now going to be in this cabinet. And, you have people like Josh Fox on Twitter acting shocked and surprised that Joe Biden is putting Neera Tanden in his cabinet. Anybody who's surprised by that is not paying attention. You're intellectually dishonest or you're just a fool, because everybody who's paying attention knew this is exactly the cabinet Joe Biden was going to pick. So I think it's really crucial that leftists stop, seeing it as eating our own. It's not eating our own. It's holding our own to account. And it's pushing the people who are, the quote unquote leaders of the movement to take risks and to go bold. I mean, Bernie Sanders made a whole campaign out of we need bold action. And then he, caved and endorsed Joe Biden. That's not bold. There's nothing bold about that. That's ridiculous. It's the opposite of bold. And so, I think that leftists really have to start using their voices and pushing the people who are, quote unquote leaders in their movements to do better. I think it's unbelievably necessary at this point. They're not going to do it on their own.
And going off the Corbyn tip that you were talking about, Alex, can we talk about the anti-Semite charges lobbied
Yes, we
against
can.
him and how detrimental that's been to the pro-Palestinian movement in the UK and possibly also in the US? And also, how much of that do you think he was an honest actor about? Because the way you describe it, he, and I agree with this, is a careerist, and he'll milk something like that until it's diminishing returns. And over here, I've seen among a lot of leftists who are pro-Palestinians, I've seen them fet him, sort of raise him up as this sacrificial lamb of the pro-Israel movement in the UK. What would be your response to that?
Well, firstly, I would say he sacrificed himself, but not in a good way, because to understand, I mean, there is a layer in British politics of people who, the middle class left, who will attach themselves to a cause as long as it doesn't cost them anything. So, and you can get something out of those people, but you should always be aware that at the moment the heat turns up, they're going to disappear like a drop of water hitting a hot gas ring. And this is exactly what happened to him. And like Misty was saying, because he was just surrounded by sycophants, he had nobody in there saying, no, if you give in to this, then this will consume your entire leadership. And this is exactly what happened. He ended up being complicit in it because he failed to make the most obvious point, which is that anybody who has been reading about the strategies of the Israeli government and a lot of this stuff also comes out of the United States as well, where, I mean, Max Blumenthal made a really good point on one of his most recent episodes, where he was talking to, I believe, Ali Abu Nima from the Electronic Intifada, where they were saying that the diplomatic and sort of intelligence staff of Israel and the United States are basically interchangeable. They're all citizens. They're all citizens of the U.S. A lot of these ideas and tactics come from the U.S. counterintelligence, academia, think tank world, and the strategy from at least 15 years ago, when they started doing it to Norman Finkelstein, was to say, well, to try the self-hating Jew angle on Jewish critics of Israel, if they paid any attention to them at all, and then to extend from that, which is that everybody who criticizes, because the strategy of the Zionists has always been, we identify all of Judaism with Israel. Therefore, if you're against Israel, you're against Jews. Doesn't matter if it's not real. We can just assert it, and because they have the most powerful forces on their side, because Israel is in the words of Joe Biden, if we didn't have Israel, we'd have to invent it to represent our interests in the Middle East. Old Joe's good for the truth when he remembered 30 years ago. But Corbyn, because he failed to point out that this is a tactic which is documented, there's Israeli diplomats and intelligence people on record admitting to it, all he needed to do in these interviews is point out what was being done. And the only person who ever did it, who went on air and did it, was Galloway. George Galloway did it, and he didn't get invited back. But Corbyn had a platform, which is why I reject this characterization of him. Oh, he's just a poor old man. Bullshit. He's a guy who had the power to do something on this. He had the power to go in front of a TV camera and talk to the nation, even if they'll misrepresent you. You go and talk to them anyway. He had that platform where he could have addressed this and actually advanced a cause which we were told he believed in for his entire career. We obviously didn't believe in it that much, because when the time came and he could have really pushed back on it, if he'd have gone on TV and said, this is a tactic outlined by the Israeli government and its backers in the United States, discredit. They tried it, the self-hating Jew line first, to discredit people like Norman Finkelstein. They're trying now the anti-Semite line to kill off any and all criticism of Israel. But that takes a level of political determination and strength of character that men like him just don't have, because it's very easy to be against the Israeli government from the backbenches of the opposition in the British Parliament. They didn't pay much attention for many years. They only started getting serious about calling you an anti-Semite when the whole boycott, divestment, and sanctions thing caught on. Then they started trying to immediately discredit people who pushed for it. So I'd say Corbyn is the master of his own downfall. He wasn't a powerless figure. He could have addressed this. He could have changed the narrative on it at any time. In fact, as soon as it started, he should have gone out and defended the people like his old political ally, Ken Livingstone, a man who I have no time for politically whatsoever. But he was done in because he was a critic of Israel. So you learn a trick from the ruling class. They don't give up their people very easily. And yet he threw everybody they demanded he sacrificed to this fake campaign. He did. Ken Livingstone, a woman called Jackie Walker, who was actually Jewish.
Chris Williamson.
Williamson was the last one. He was ultimately thrown under the bus by Corbyn. And then, of course, they went and forced his former ally, Rebecca Long Bailey, who was meant to be the hope of the left, to also grovel and apologize. Now all of the Labour left were groveling and apologizing because ultimately, again, there's no force countering the ruling class force. So if the force is all coming from one direction, what happens to the object? You know, it's basic laws of politics and basic laws of motion. You know, unless you have the counter force there, you're not going to get anything. And it's exactly what happened with Corbyn. And you could see it coming. I could see it coming in 2017, and all I had to do was just to look at the man's record. So yeah,
I'm a dumb Yankee, and I saw it coming. You know, like this is I don't even follow British politics that closely. I mean, I follow it to some degree, but I mean, anybody who knows anything about Israel and the way that they operate and the way that they attack their opponents, anybody could see that coming. And it was really disappointing to me when he threw Chris Williamson under the bus, because I love Chris Williamson, that I was done with Jeremy Corbyn at that point. And that's why I really despise the argument, oh, well, Jeremy Corbyn's just a nice guy, or Bernie Sanders is just a nice guy. Nice guys don't throw their friends under the bus. That doesn't happen. Nice guys don't do that. That's not a thing.
The fact that he had no loyalty to a guy like Livingstone, who he'd been allies and friends with for 30 years, that just said to me that's a man of very low character, because the character of yourself and any person only comes out really when you're under the hammer. And when he was under the hammer, he ran away and threw everybody else off a cliff. So he needs to be the cult that still surrounds him will die off, but it needs to be killed off, because it's extremely damaging to still keep looking to him for anything when he's failed so obviously. And the same would apply to Sanders as well. I mean, he's still sending out money demands, old Bernie. You know, you gave me 220 million and I pissed it up a wall. Give me some more and I'll hold Joe Biden accountable. Meanwhile,
the other day he sent out an email. He sent out an email the other day saying, send me money so that I can fight for a progressive agenda. First of all, what progressive agenda? Second of all, when has he ever fought for anything? I've never seen Bernie Sanders put up a fight, ever, never, not one time.
Nicaragua. He went to Nicaragua.
You know, this whole thing and I've said this before, the mythology of Bernie Sanders, to my mind, is going to be even more difficult to kill off than the Barack Obama mythology. People are holding on to this. They're holding on to this caricature that they have of this guy, the soundbite, and the photo of him getting arrested, being chained to a black woman. And they have this guy built up in their heads that isn't even based on reality. Most of these people who have this sort of hero worship of him don't even know his record. If you confront them on his imperialism, they're clueless. They have no idea that he voted for, the Iraq Liberation Act or, the bombing of Kosovo or any of these things. And so they don't even know who they're supporting, but they've put him up on this pedestal and built this mythology around him that he's going to be their savior. And it's really troubling. I don't know how to combat that. I don't know how to, it's a weird kind of psychological comfort zone for people where they think that this one person's going to save them. And I don't know how to get people to see that there is no voting your way out of this. You're going to have to get in the streets. It's going to suck. It's going to be really hard. But if you want any of the things that you claim to be fighting for, that's what it takes. I mean, that's really it. So, I mean, I don't know how to get past that for people. And, you know, something else that I've noticed on the left too is not me, but the left has become very sheepish on seriously critical issues, whether it's the anti-war movement, which has all but disappeared, or, you know, the free speech, free press, free Assange movement. I can't get any of the members of the squad to even mention Julian Assange. I can't get Bernie Sanders to even mention Julian Assange. Jeremy Corbyn, to his credit, has mentioned Julian Assange. He has spoken out in his defense a few times. I'd like for him to be a lot more vocal. But, you know, it's really something that it's really depressing. I don't know what happened, to be honest with you. These are issues that used to be cornerstones of a leftist movement, and it's all but disappeared. Is that something that you see in the UK as well, as far as like the Assange anti-war sort of thing? Is it as bad there as it is here?
Yeah, well, our whole press arrangement here has always been much worse because we don't have a First Amendment, which is one of the things that unifies a lot of Americans, is the defense of free speech. It's the elite that wants to see it trashed. And the elite includes the squadists and everybody else, because they have become enamored of censorship, because they represent, again, this middle class layer which wants to stamp out the bad people and stamp out the bad thoughts and the deplorable thoughts, which they are convinced is what brought them Trump. We have a similar thing here. I mean, we just had the editor-in-chief of the Canary news site, Kerry-Ann Mendoza. Again, somebody whose politics I'm not particularly fond of, but she is very consistent on the Israel-Palestine question, so I give her credit for that. And she got suspended from Twitter after a campaign waged by an organization formed by Keir Starmer's chief of staff behind the scenes, called Stop the Fake News. So this is an example of what's. I know that a lot of the grey zone stuff covers this, which is the linkage between the sort of the think tank world, the intelligence people, the various sort of corporate media actors who want to preserve their territory, to stamp out internet freedom. And you can add in the squadists and the sort of most of the American left with that as well, who are perfectly happy. Now they think they've got their little lane carved out for themselves inside as the loyal opposition to Joe Biden inside the Democratic Party and a big subscriber base. Now they want to pull the ladder up to make sure that nobody else gets near them and defend their newly found embrace by Joe Biden as he sniffs their hair. That's a disturbing image. I shouldn't have mentioned it. The same problem is here, which is that the instinct towards censorship is because, again, it comes back to the class origins. The British and American middle class do share two things in common, one of which is a horrific fear of the working class, and the other one of which is a strong desire towards petty tyranny. I think it's probably a global thing, but my main experience is with the British middle class, and believe me, the British middle class leftist would be an incredibly petty tyrant if he got his way. You see that with just some of the things they've supported over the years, like, it just sounds minor, but stuff like smoking bans, which bothered me when I used to smoke more, but just like the sort of petty kind of hectoring censoriousness, that's typical of the British middle class leftist to a T. I imagine it's true. I know American middle class leftist as well, which of course plays very well with their new friends in the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, MI5, and MI6. We're more than happy to have AOC go on there and demand that Mark Zuckerberg censor people for using bad words, because that's how we get Trump. You know, Trump used bad words on Facebook means bad words in presidency. Orange man bad, vote Biden. Censor everybody. But the fact that they're prepared to give up fundamental democratic rights is basically just because they've decided that their way of after their interests is as an adjunct to the liberal end of the capitalist class. That's what they've decided, and that's true in Britain. It's true in the United States. That liberal end of which is big tech, which is green tech, so the phony Green New Deal shit, and it's also like the Democratic Party. They have chosen to make the left about shielding that portion of the ruling class and saying that that portion of the ruling class is somehow superior to Trump's bit of it, which is the more sort of nationally focused capitalist enterprises, like some of the fossil fuel industries, some of the weapons industries, some of the more smaller bits of capital, the less powerful sections of the ruling class, actually. So their argument is now that somehow the liberal big tech CIA bit is somehow more superior to the oil company bit. And therefore we need to censor everybody.
It seems to be a lot of virtue signaling. And it's very condescending. To tell me that I need Mark Zuckerberg to decide what information I'm allowed to be presented with, or what I'm allowed to read or see or know, is very condescending. And I think that it's turning off a lot of, working class, middle class people, because I don't need some Silicon Valley tech bro to, make sure that I'm not damaged by, harmful information. I'm a grown up. I can handle that all by myself. And I understand that there is an issue with, misinformation, disinformation, but there's no greater perpetrator of those things than our own mainstream media. So unless you want to start censoring CNN and deplatforming MSNBC for pushing another illegal war, or another drone strike, or another tax break for billionaires, I don't want to hear it. I really don't want to hear it. If you're not starting there, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear any part of it. I'm never going to be okay with censorship. It's never going to benefit the left. It always comes back to bite the left in the ass. And, they feel good about it now because, Alex Jones got deplatformed. Milo Yiannopoulos got deplatformed, and these guys are Nazis and this is a good thing. That's how they get you. That's how they manufacture the consent for this stuff. And soon it's coming to you. We've already seen it. I mean, they've been, like you said, the Canary, they got deplatformed. I mean, we've seen Telesur get deplatformed, and Venezuela Analysis, and all of these, more left-leaning socialist sort of outlets are getting censored. But nobody pays attention to that. They, Alex Jones got deplatformed, we're winning. And it's just this really bizarre kind of paternalistic, protect me from the bad stuff mentality. And it's very weird to have left-leaning politicians being the one championing these things.
It's the neoliberal blob that smothers the United States. And Alex, just to switch gears for a bit, since we've been talking about Israel and Palestine, and basically the left's refusal to take any kind of substantive activism toward at least alleviating what's been happening there for 70 plus years, I wanted to ask you about Israel's recent assassination of Iran's top nuclear scientist, and what your thoughts are on that, and what you think that may bode for the near future.
I would say that when you're talking about Israel's crimes, I think what we really should be doing is talking about the US and Britain's crimes, because the British Empire created Israel to act as our, they called it back in the 1920s, they said, we're going to turn this new land for the Jews. It's going to be Ulster in the Middle East, and if you know anything about British and Irish history, like we've planted Ireland with militant Protestantism in order to batter the Catholic population into submission. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what we plan to do with the Zionist movement. Stick it in the middle of the Middle East, and then use that as our gunman, essentially, to make sure that the Arabs could never unite and drive the British Empire out. Same reason we created Saudi Arabia. And those relationships then got primarily passed over to Washington when the British Empire started to hit the skids. But really, so it's a US assassination of that Iranian general. They've just, that Iranian scientist, they've just got their asset to do it for them. There's no doubt to my mind that this originated within the White House or Pentagon or CIA, one of the three or all of them, with the full agreement of the British government as well. and they just got the Israelis to do it for them. Israel doesn't act without the full approval of the United States. It can't, because it's dependent on the United States government for its survival. So, yeah, this is a US crime against Iran. The Israeli connection gives them just enough plausible deniability to avoid going into a full-scale war. And a little bit of this could be a Trump fuck you to Biden on his way out the door, basically, because Biden, well, not really Biden, but Obama and his sort of cabal of guys wanted to essentially, they were approaching Iran in a cleverer fashion than Trump has done, or the Republicans would have done. There, and the same with Cuba as well, they had a much cleverer and more subtle way of going about it. They were going to try and bring them in from the cold and tie them into the capitalist order in a way that they're not at the moment. That is a cleverer way from their class's perspective of managing this. Trump just basically did this to, really sold to him by Pompeo saying, hey, Donald, if you do this, it's really going to fuck up the Democrats' plans. Mm-hmm. As to what it'll lead to, I suspect what has happened before is that Iran responds in a more subtle way than you would expect, which is that they tend to retaliate in kind. For instance, all the way back to the 80s, when the USS Vincennes shot down that Iranian airliner in tail end of the Iran-Iraq war, they responded by blowing up Pan Am 103 over Scotland. That wasn't Gaddafi, it was the Iranians.
1988 is when
that was. The Iranians contracted it out to the DFLP, Democratic Front for Liberation of Palestine. They carried it out, and the Americans and British couldn't say anything because they needed Iranian consent to make war on Saddam Hussein. So the Iranians are very clever in the way that they responded there. They're doing the same. They did the same thing with when Soleimani was killed. They responded. Missile strike, which looked good, but it hit an almost empty American base. It just sort of, though the missiles were so powerful, it did apparently damage some American service personnel's balance and hearing. But they also, and if you believe the stories floating around, they also killed the CIA's main guy in the Middle East, a guy who went by the name of Ayatollah Mike. They shot down his plane in Afghanistan and fucking killed him. That was the guy who planned Soleimani's assassination. And it's never been talked about in the US or British media that this guy's dead or that he even existed. But it's in English language press from the Middle East. So they'll respond in a way that is not going to lead to a war, because this is what the US and the Iranians have done for over 40 years now, which is that they'll snipe at each other, but they won't go full on into a war situation with each other, because that would bear a heavy cost that certainly the Iranian government doesn't want to pay, and also the US doesn't want to pay. They do not want to be in a situation where the Iranian government sinks that armada that they've got in the Persian Gulf, right? Because they've got a lot of big, expensive targets there, which the Iranians have had 40 years to plan how to get rid of. Mm-hmm. And you can't invade and occupy Iran either. You can't, not with the forces the US has at its disposal. What is Joe Biden going to do a draft? They're going to have recruitment queues around the block in London, Manchester, Boston, and Alabama just to go out and fucking die for Joe Biden in Iran? No.
And Americans are so ahistorical when it comes to this. They forget the Iran-Iraq war that lasted 8 years in the 80s, and how Saddam at the beginning said, this is going to be a whirlwind war. We're going to trounce them, with the full support of the CIA and other intelligence and military agencies. And they were ground down. The Iraqi military was ground down over 8 years. Not that the Iranian military wasn't, but they were not going to give up. Even after chemical weapons were used on them by Saddam, they were not going to give up. And Americans nowadays don't remember that Iranians will fight to the death. They're very tough, very proud people. And I say that to their credit. And I think, like you said, it's absurd if America, along with the UK and France, most likely, would decide to make that move of war with Iran. But crazier things have happened, like the war that's still happening on Iraq. So
yeah, I mean, I would say that Iraq was seen as an easy option by the Bush administration. because they could knock over the very demoralized, ill-equipped Iraqi army quite quickly. Iran is not ill-equipped, and even with the sanctions, they've still got more than enough firepower to knock out quite a lot of American equipment and personnel. And ever since Nixon, no American president has wanted to get into a kind of war which would lead to a mass casualty event, because Vietnam destabilized the United States to such a great degree that they had to get rid of the draft. And they were open about it, that if they'd have tried to carry that war on, the army would have mutinied. So they can't wage those wars. But again, this is a contradiction of capitalism. They have to keep waging aggressive campaigns because that's how the US empire and the British empire sustains themselves, partly how. But they can't wage full-on invasions because that's very risky. They may end up in a war, as you said, Jesse, by falling into it. But their ideal situation is Trump wanted his maximum pressure campaign, and if you asked the likes of Bolton and Pompeo what it meant, it would probably, their idea would have been that eventually there would have been a fracture open up in the Iranian state forces, and some kind of internal coup would have taken place. That's actually less likely thanks to the maximum pressure campaign than it was before. Biden will try to go back to a situation where he is able to, by drawing them back into some kind of agreement and hopefully getting them more exposed to the forces of the global market, that they can actually cause a split that way. Probably neither is going to work. And again, another contradiction would be the fact that the Republicans and the Democrats have made a partisan issue out of it between themselves and now can't agree on what they want to do. So the likelihood is we'll continue along this route until the big question is going to be not what happens in Iran, but how sustainable is the Saudi regime and the Israeli regime, because that's what British and American power is based on in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. If one of those two collapses in on itself due to its own internal problems, then we've got real problems, because that would mean that the principal means of controlling the Middle East is gone, the House of Saud and the Israeli government. If one of those falls, then US and British influence in the region is in real deep shit. Mm-hmm. Because without the Saudis, then the American currency collapses due to its linkage to the oil price. Without the Israelis, then our ability to project military power into the area also goes. So that's where this will be decided. How sustainable is the Saudis and the Israelis as the fronts for American and British power? If we can't sustain them, then the ruling classes of both our country has a real problem.
I think that's a great point.
I think that's a great point, and I think that's a huge problem when your economy is based on death and destruction and chaos. When your entire economy is, I mean, not your entire, but most of your economy hinges on imperialism and war. That's, not a great thing. And that's something that you should probably re-examine as a country and work to remedy. It's a very strange thing to me that's controversial.
Yeah, and this is an inevitable stage of capitalism unfolding, because your country and mine are two of the oldest capitalist nations. It's maturing and going rotten here the quickest. And one of the laws of it is that the level of profit actually deteriorates over time. In Marxist terms, it's called the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which means, in blunt terms, you make more profit in the less developed stages, because it means you can have more people readily available for exploitation in less developed societies, and resources are more available for you to grab. And that's why you make so much money out of the destruction of societies. So, like, Libya was fairly well developed. Mm-hmm. If you took the rhetoric of the liberals seriously, which is that they want to see global development, and one of the other horrific bullshit buzzwords they use, well, then they shouldn't have wanted the destruction of that society. But it got destroyed, and Syria was almost destroyed. Iraq completely destroyed. Afghanistan wasn't much there to start with, but it's all very profitable to destroy it, because the people there are more desperate now. So when you step in, you can more easily exploit them through in either employment in hyper exploitative conditions in country, or as waves of migrant labor coming out of it. by the destruction of infrastructure. And well, now you can make money rebuilding it. And this is also why they do it. They do it internally as well. Why is it that huge areas of America are left to rot? Why is it that whole formerly industrialized areas of Britain are left to collapse in on themselves? Because by reducing essentially whole areas to rubble, they can then reduce the population to being very desperate, prepared to work for very low wages, and then they can rebuild again and make profit. Creative destruction. That's been built into the capitalist system. It's true what they do overseas. It's true what they do here. And we need to understand that and also understand that the people who are the talking heads on television and the political people, they don't often understand that because they're just employees of the system. They're not governing it. The system is almost ungovernable. It runs according to its own laws. The individuals come and go and can make a difference, but it's why the future is mass working class movements against the system, because trying to fiddle with the system as it stands, well, you might as well try and swim through a trough of nuclear waste. You might get to the other side, but you'll look different when you have.
Yeah, that's another great point.
The biggest problems with the left right now is that they, despite all the.
Hey, Misty, your audio went down a little bit.
Did this last, or was it last time, or? I hate my microphone.
Sounds a bit better.
Okay. I'd have to shove it in my face in. So stupid. Anyway, can you hear me okay?
That's a bit better.
No? Yes, no? Okay.
Just try going ahead.
Okay. One of my problems with the left right now is that, despite all of their bluster, they've convinced themselves that, if we just get these tiny, incremental changes around the edges of this crap system that we have, that everything will be fine. And it's not going to work. And there's no way that we can kind of fiddle around the edges of a capitalistic system and be successful. It needs to all be torn down. And I know that sounds very accelerationist and whatever big scary word you want to use to describe me, but that's reality. You cannot just tinker with the system and fix it bit by bit. That just isn't going to work. It needs to be completely destroyed, like down to rubble, and then take that rubble and spread the ashes throughout the world. So that it cannot reform. And there is no tinkering around this. And it's a very frustrating thing to see leftists pretending like, oh, well, if we just vote for Joe Biden, then we can push him a little bit to the left. And then we can, then in Kamala Harris, we can push her to the left in 2024. And you guys, people are dying. Like, I don't know how much time you think people have to be tinkering around these edges.
This duo is not one that reeks of human rights or concern for humanity at all. Kamala Harris was locking up children and their families as the DA in the richest city in
more jails, less schools.
California. And then you have Joe Biden, who's the consummate neoliberal warmonger. I think if Joe Biden could take the form of a woman, he would be Hillary Clinton. These are not good people. They're terrible people. And to think that you are going to somehow improve them in a way that benefits you when they have the full weight of capitalism and military and the prison industrial complex behind them, it's just a complete delusion. But the problem is, especially on the coasts here, a lot of people don't know that. And a lot of it is because they don't care to know. They're more interested in thinking, okay, well, it's something better than Trump, so things are probably going to get better, and I can just go on with my conspicuous consumption and whatever else doesn't make me have to think too hard about what's happening in the world. And I agree with you. And people think when you say tearing the system down that you mean walking up the steps of the Capitol with a bunch of Molotovs and just tossing them at the doors. It's not. Maybe it'll get to that. I don't know. But I see a lot of blind ignorance, at least where I live on the East Coast, pretty close to New York. And I see it on the West Coast as well. And I think as long as people are burying their heads in the toilet with the turd in it that you talked about earlier, Alex, just goes around and around. nothing is going to fundamentally change, as Joe Biden said.
Campaign slogan: nothing will fundamentally change. The problem that
the capitalist undergirding that you bring up, Alex, I think that's so important, and it's so missed in so many analyses of what's happening. So I just want to underscore that.
Yeah, I wanted to make that point because as capitalism develops, it becomes more and more of a self-sustaining machine. Actually, if you look at the corporate structures in Britain and the United States, even the biggest companies now, the chief executives are just employees. There's no, like, it's not like the old days with JP Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, people like that whose families own the companies. Even the likes of Zuckerberg, Bezos and co, they've got big shareholdings. The guys who own Google, same thing. They maybe have a controlling interest, but they still they don't control completely those companies anymore. And ultimately, one day they'll be replaced, and the company could continue. So the same is true of the state machine. The last guy to try and actually be president and run it was Nixon, and which is a weird thing to think about.
Mm-hmm.
But he did fall foul of the CIA and the FBI in the end, who used an intelligence asset in the form of Woodward, who is an intelligence asset. Otherwise, he wouldn't have written friendly biographies of the last 5 fucking presidents. But then they elevate that to the liberal, the great moment of the liberal press, Watergate, when it was in actual fact a stitch-up job done by the FBI and CIA on Nixon, because he actually wanted to run the machine the way he wanted to run it. And since then, all of your presidents have never even tried to actually rule. Gerald Ford had no brain. Jimmy Carter was just basically ended up introducing neoliberalism. Reagan famously had no brain at all. George H.W. Bush was a deep state guy to the absolute core. Clinton was a deeply compromised degenerate who could easily have been controlled. Very clever one, but same thing. W. Bush, no brain, run by Dick Cheney, who's just a physical personification of American capitalism. And Barack Obama, in his book, his latest opus, which every school child in Chicago has been given in PDF form, which I would homeschool my children from that point onwards, just to have not Barack Obama's PDFs forced on them. But he says in the book, which is
mea culpa about drone assassinating America.
Yes, but he said something. The only interesting thing he said, apparently, in the whole book, which is that he said we had a machine set up for an anti-terrorist machine set up, and I didn't feel like I could change it. Which is basically a good epitaph for not just him, but for all of them, which is the machine runs itself, and if you try and get in the way of it, it will chew you up and spit you out, as it has done with Trump. Trump was no real threat to it, but because he deviated ever so slightly and annoyed some of the key people within it, they did an intelligence operation on his administration for 4 years called Russiagate and Associated Interests to destroy him. That's just a fact. It doesn't matter whether you like Trump or not, which is a very shallow way of looking at it anyway. Real way of looking at it is whose interest does he serve? He was just backed by a slightly different set of ruling class factions than the Democrats were. But the fact is that Trump,
policy-wise, he wasn't much different than Barack Obama. Policy.
No, he ended up being, and that says a lot, doesn't it? The fact that these two very apparently different men ended up doing a lot of the same things, and Trump ended up just being a standard Jeb Bush type Republican, but with more aggressive tweets. Which is at least with some of them
louder and more crude, and who occasionally said the quiet part loud, which is why they really didn't like him.
Yeah, and
when he said we want their oil, he had to go. He had to go.
Yeah, he brought too many things out.
So I would say that he's been much friendlier with Netanyahu than Obama could ever attain, and that's why. I know Sheldon Adelson is pulling the strings behind the scenes, but that sort of buddy that Trump and Netanyahu have had with Adelson and his money pulling the strings has allowed Trump to get away with some egregious things in Palestine, like moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, as well as in Syria, where not only has he given the green light for Israel to annex the Golan Heights and rename them Trump Heights. But if you look at a map of Syria and where the military bases are mostly collected, it's in northwestern Syria, let's say Western Syria, and that's where the bulk of the oil fields are. And again, this goes back to what we were speaking about earlier, that this is imperialism at the behest of capitalism for dying empires.
Yeah, it's and also I would say that the Trump, again, with the Israel, was acting in a very transactional way, which is that the personal psychology of the man seems to be that, hey, Benjamin, I did all this shit for you. Right, you got to tell your guys in the US to get behind me. And then he was shocked that Netanyahu did what he was always going to do, is he'd come out and recognize Biden. Because as Ben Netanyahu said, it doesn't really matter that much. He might not like a round of golf with Trump, but he'll get just as much out of Kamala. I'm saying Kamala because Joe, I don't know whether he's actually broken his foot or whether they finally just slowly, they're going to say next he's got gangrene, and then he's actually dead before Inauguration Day. And I think as long as the Electoral College has met and voted, then they can just inaugurate Kamala. But to return to the Israel question, Trump was very transactional and brutish in it, because that's the nature of the man, and also the nature of the people backing him up as well, in that he thought that, well, if I just give them everything they wanted, then the evangelicals will be more loyal to me. I will, Mike Pence will look happier. Pastor John Hagee will mention Trump in favorable terms in a searingly anti-Semitic but also pro-Israel sermon. But Biden isn't going to reverse the move of the embassy to Jerusalem. I mean, Trump was just crude enough to do it, whereas I don't think a Democrat would have done it in that way. But they're not getting out of Syria. They're going to stay there because there's a serious two-way contest, maybe more, going on in Syria now over who gets to dominate that region of the Mediterranean. Is it going to be a more Russian influence, or is it going to be an American show? And that struggle's not going to end until one of them has come out on top. They're doing it indirectly, but that's the danger of now when you have three different powers in the world and their associated blocks all struggling over different territories, which is what we got now. We've got those aligned with the United States, those aligned with the Russians, and those aligned with the Chinese. Now, the blocks behind each shift slightly, but that's now the three-way division of the world. With the decay internally of the United States, then it's more dangerous now because it's having to openly compete in a way it didn't think it would have to. But the Biden presidency, if it's going to be defined by anything, is going to be defined by trying to recapture the dominance of the United States overseas in a way that I don't think that they can, because they've been muscled out in East Africa. They've been muscled out by the Chinese, who are making slightly better offers to the local stooges to run it in their interests. The Americans aren't making those offers. They're basically blundering around Africa with AfricaCom, making threats to everybody. Stay in line or we kill you. So it's no wonder that even the French are staging a revival in West Africa. But again, we're talking about a scramble for Africa 140 years after the first one, because capitalism doesn't move us on in many areas of the world. We just end up dividing and redividing, which is all that the Biden presidency is going to do. How can they redivide the world in the interests of Wall Street, the military-industrial complex, and Silicon Valley? And the answer is paint a rainbow flag on a cruise missile and call it liberation.
As long as it's solar power. Solar power.
So we're coming up on an hour here, Alex. And before we let you go, I wanted to ask you about two things, if you could talk about them to us quickly. You tweeted something out, I think it was earlier today, about Robert Fisk and how now that he's dead, he's being smeared by former colleagues, a lot of who work for corporate news outlets and have for a long time. And what you think that says about the state of journalism, political journalism, war journalism, that this man who spent 40 years of his life,
this legend,
legend
of journalism,
dozens upon dozens of times, and getting it right almost all the time. What does it say to you about journalism that it's gotten to this point? And then lastly, I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a bit about the documentary you're working on.
Well, on the Fisk question, I mean, it's an explosion of bitterness from younger, non-up-and-comers in the journalistic profession. Because Fisk was interesting from a number of levels, but he was really the last representative inside Britain of the kind of reporter who came up through the old local newspaper system, which doesn't exist anymore, or not in the same way, who worked his way into being a foreign correspondent and then retained that position for as long as I've been alive, 38 years. A lot of the hatred that guys like that get, be it images or people, is from the younger backbiters, is because they were able to come of age and be the great crusading journalist in an age where it was still just about possible to do that and retain a position within a major media organization. It's not possible to do that anymore. To get into a major media organization, you basically need to work for nothing for extended periods of time, which most people can't afford to do. Then you need to viciously shank everybody in front of you in the line to try and get a promotion. And that appeals to only a very certain section of the population, which is nasty, backbiting rich kids who, to secure their position, will do anything that the system asks of them. And now you're in a situation where they're under threat from online, they're under threat from independent media who exist predominantly in the online sphere. They hated Fisk in his lifetime because he was so well regarded they couldn't really touch him without creating more shit for themselves. Now he's dead, they feel they can exercise their sort of bitterness and jealousy. And also a lot of it is on a psychological level, it's self-loathing. Some of these people maybe at some stage wanted to actually be like him, but found that being like him now meant that a well-rewarded career was absolutely impossible. So they chose the well-rewarded career and they chose the bank balance, but then they also fucking hate themselves. And so they have to exercise that ghost in some way. I would say that, Fisk was the last of that generation who could go through the old capitalist media and carve out an independent niche within it with some degree of institutional protection. That just doesn't exist anymore. So the only people you're going to get now is the likes of Oz Katerji writing hysterical tweets about how Fisk was evil and made stuff up, even though he'll never say what stuff he's supposed to have made up, because he hasn't got anything.
Do you think somebody with Oz Katerji's attention span has actually read any of Fisk's books?
I think he's probably read the first quarter of the Wikipedia summary.
Yeah. I can see that guy reading The Great War for Civilization or Pity the Nation. Those are 1,000+ page books. This guy is reading all the time. When does he have time to sit down and...
But it's not even about really the truth or otherwise of what Fisk reported. It's about the fact that they have to try and bury him again because they have to. It's a disciplinary process within the profession. Everybody needs to toe the line. Nobody steps out of it. Nobody get any ideas of mentioning anything awkward like the Assange case or the Snowden files or anything like that, or the fact that most of the media in Britain now is reduced to being an appendage of MI5 and the police agencies. You've got to make sure that line is consistently enforced by attacking and smearing anybody who steps outside of it. And that's exactly what they're doing to a dead man now, which, to be honest,
it's really gross.
It's gross, but it just makes them look really pathetic. They couldn't even come at him when he was alive, not really. So they have to do it now he's dead and gone, which, he's just sad and pathetic and just reveals just how empty not only these people are, but the institutions.
Yeah, you did just make a really good point I want to hammer home, that this isn't necessarily just about attacking Robert Fisk. It's about attacking investigative journalism.
Right.
Yes.
That is where we're at right now. They are attacking Craig Murray right now, over and over and over again. They are attacking Julian Assange right now. They're trying to kill him basically in prison right now with COVID. They're bringing prisoners into his house block who have COVID. There are 56 people living around him. He has an underlying lung condition. They're trying to kill him. This is an attack on investigative journalism. It's not so much about Robert Fisk. It is to some degree because he was a successful investigative journalist, but on a bigger scale, this is about attacking investigative journalism as an institution, as a way of maintaining yourself in the world as a journalist. They want to discourage absolutely anybody and everybody that they can from thinking that that is a viable career choice. They do not want you. They want you to be a stenographer, basically. If you're willing to be a stenographer to power and write what the deep state tells you, you can have a job in journalism. But if you try to go outside of that in any way, shape, or form, this is basically what will happen to you. Robert Fisk, Julian Assange, Craig Murray, these are the proverbial heads on the stakes. These are the warnings. These are the, if you mess with us, this is what happens to you. And I think that that's a very critical point to push home to people, because the war on journalism right now is very, very real and very, very dangerous. So that's a huge, a hugely important point to make, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So that said, that great point made, can you just tell us a little bit, Alex, about the film you're working on?
Yeah,
I'm very excited.
A film project with the provisional title of Bitter Charity. It's about the not just about charities, but it's about the NGO complex and its usage by imperialism to batter down the sovereignty of countries and to essentially erode the authority of states that have been targeted for regime change by setting up new and unaccountable power structures within them that are only answerable to ultimately to the intelligence services and governments of US, Britain, and the other imperialist powers. I started doing this because I initially was going to do something on the Ethiopian war, internal war with the Tigray region. But the more I looked into it, the more I thought, well, there's a much bigger question that I can address here, which is, what is the role of the NGOs in the modern capitalist era? So I put out just a very brief slamming together of different bits of archive, including an unbearable 10-minute sequence of Bob Geldof, for which I can only apologize if you actually watched all of that shit. But he says that the reason I included it is because it's what something Geldof says at the very beginning, which he says, we've just had a very generous donation from Sheikh Al Maktoum of the UAE. So my personal thanks to him. And that I could have just released that and called it the film, because that sums everything up, which is the guy who runs the UAE is a vicious bastard who's an employee basically of British imperialism. He owns a shitload of property over here. He's protected by the British security services. His internal security forces are always headed by a British intelligence guy or British former senior ranking police officer. He is essentially our guy in the Middle East. And the fact that guy was getting his reputation whitewashed over 35 years ago by the likes of Geldof tells you everything you need to know about what the modern charitable sector is all about. Then you break it down further and you see, well, what is the role of the charities in these countries that were formerly called the third world, developing world? Well, the role is to establish to undermine the state structures. So, something like USAID, which is a CIA front, something like, or even like Amnesty International, which is heavily influenced by or run by, in some cases, MI6. Their operations in any particular country are there to basically build alternative centers of power to the central government. So in order to undermine the central government's authority by having a center of power that can dole out money and resources to people, but which is wholly unaccountable to anybody other than the foreign power that put them there in the first place. And you do it wearing the mask of, oh, well, we just want to help people. Oh, well, we just want to stop this human rights abuse here or there or wherever. And it's such an important part of the laundering of imperialism's reputation that it has to be explored and put out there in full terms as to so people can understand it. Because when you get something like, and this is one of the chapters in the film is going to be on Haiti, Clinton Global Initiative, what happened to Haiti after the earthquake. There was all this, suddenly Haiti was in the news over 10 years ago now. That, oh, Lord, we got to do something, we got to do something, we got to do something. To which the only response should be, fuck off, you've done enough over the last 200 years to that country. But they used the real and terrible tragedy of an earthquake and a state run by a US stooge anyway, thanks to the fact that they'd overthrown Aristide twice, to bring in all kinds of like looting of that nation under the mask of, oh, well, we're just trying to rebuild. And if you actually follow any Haitian Twitter accounts, I follow one very good one. I think she's called Madame Boukman or something. She posts regularly about Haitian internal politics. The whole country's just getting looted by various different foreign interests. And it was all under the guise of like, well, we're helping them rebuild. And all that happened was all the money just got diverted into the pockets of either local stooges or different business guys. Then you take it one stage further into you find the Oxfam scandal of like the mass sexual exploitation of like children by pedophiles employed by the charities. And that's not, that's, to use an Americanism, that's not the bug. These charities are all meant to serve the purposes of imperialism. So who do they have in charge of them? Deeply compromised people who can easily be controlled. That's why Jeffrey Epstein could describe himself as a philanthropist. These are all integrated into the imperialist system. And I concluded that first clip I posted with Fred Hampson talking about political education, because he's talking there to somebody who he's looking to work with, and he's saying, no, you can't. We're not into just going somewhere and giving somebody something. We're into helping, educating them so they can run their own community. Not that we're going to land here, set something up, and try and make them beholden to us, which is what the Democratic Party does. See, like you get like right wingers in America making this point about the Democratic Party making communities beholden to it through administering like welfare or charitable stuff and stuff like that. But the right wingers do that for their own reasons, just for opportunistic reasons. But there is a truth in it, which Fred Hampton is pointing out in that clip, which is saying, if you want to make a community beholden to you, you co-opt its leaders using a patronage system. You dole out various different grants and different monies to people, different resources to get them on your side. And then you control enough of the so-called community leaders in order to manipulate that community to do what you want. And that's why I concluded with the Hampton clip, because that's why the US political establishment was so terrified of the guy, because both sides of it didn't want a guy like that around. And why also I opened with Thomas Sankara saying, we reject your aid, because your aid is not there to help us, it is there to enslave us. And that's
there's a great quote where he says something like, whoever feeds you will oppress you. And that's so true. It really is a mechanism of learned helplessness,
Yeah, this is why the whole debate about foreign aid in both the United States and Britain is bullshit, because you got the right saying, oh, well, we shouldn't give these people foreign aid, and the left saying, oh, we need to help them. And both are disgusting and wrong, which is that the liberals just want a situation where they have a controlled population, and the right pretend they don't want that, but actually do, because they just manage it in the same way, but with different rhetoric. So that's the aim, is to bring all that to light using archival footage from sort of open source stuff like news agencies that I can just use. There's all kinds of stuff out there that can demonstrate the point. It's going to be coming in several different chapters, basically. Each is going to be about an hour long. So there's going to be one entirely based on Haiti, because what the Clintons did to that country on behalf of US imperialism is a disgusting story which needs to be more widely told.
Absolutely.
Also looking at the role of the charitable sector in Ethiopia and East Africa, and then looking more widely at the human rights NGOs like Amnesty, like Human Rights Watch, which, and from the very beginning, again, the Fred Hampton connection, one of the founders of Amnesty International was an intelligence asset who was implicated in the plot to kill Fred Hampton,
Right.
the ultimately successful plot to kill Fred Hampton. And this is the people who go around the world saying, well, we need to defend human rights. Clearly, they were a stitch-up job done basically to target the enemies of Britain and the United States, principally then to target the old communist states. Now it's just anybody who gets in the way. And they had to kill a guy like Fred Hampton because he not only understood the way that things were, but could tell it to people in a way that ordinary people could understand. So that's what's coming. It's when I took this on, I thought, well, it's not going to be too hard. Well, maybe it is, but by March, I should have the first chapter ready to go. Going to sort out some kind of online premiere event for it, but I will be updating as I go along. So just keep an eye out on my Twitter account, and I'll update as to when we've got the first part finished.
Great. We look forward to that.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I think that, this is a topic that I think does not get nearly enough attention. The NGO, the charity, the philanthropy, the Bill Gates, all of that stuff. People talk about it some, but there hasn't really been like a deep dive into the more kind of devious nature of it. So I'm really excited to see what you come up with. So, I hope everybody will keep an eye out on your Twitter feeds to stay updated on that. And on that note, do you want to tell everybody where they can find you, where they can find Red Star Radio?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter under the title of Alex Davidson 82. I've been promising a website for a while now, but it is finally going to be launched soon. There's going to be the Red Star Radio website where you can find the back catalogue of all the podcasts that I've done. And also I'm in the process of downloading and then re-uploading the videos from YouTube. So if I get my account snapped on there or banned, then you can find copies of it on the website. So it's reclaiming my own work from the tech giant. So keep an eye. You can find me on YouTube just under Red Star, under my own name, Alexander Davidson, and you can find the podcast on all your major networks under Red Star Radio. We've got an episode for the podcast coming out this week where I interview Tara McCormack. She's an academic from the University of Leicester here about the horrific mistakes that the trade unions in Britain have made when responding to the government's COVID policies, specifically the lockdowns, and why unions being in favor of those is a terrible mistake. So keep an eye out for that.
All right.
Excellent.
So,
okay, well, I
think
we're good to. Yeah. Go ahead, Jesse.
No, I was just saying. You want to take us out?
Yeah. I get. Yeah, totally. Our guest today has been Alexander Davidson. He's amazing, super wicked smart. His show's great. If you guys want to check that out, I definitely highly recommend it. Just thanks to Jesse, as always, for co-hosting this party with me. And thanks to everybody who's watching. See you guys later.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Misty.